Hello, hello. Welcome to our continuation of our journey through Proverbs. Since we're starting in chapter 2. As I was reading chapter 2 and I was just going to transfer it over to my iPad to be able to make the notes, I was going to go ahead and do the whole chapter. But as I was reading this first sentence, which turns out is just which is the first 5 verses, I was like, wow, there's no way we're getting past this in one video. So I decided to just go ahead and start us off with verses 1 through 5. So that's where we're going to get started. The reason being, it was the first sentence, and it is just a massive thought. It's not necessarily an introduction. It was just so rich, and I think you'll see why I made the decision in just a second. So let's get going. So let's read it together. My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search it for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. Okay, so, all of chapter 2 is great, but there is so much going on here. And let me point out the key reasons why I decided to just go ahead and focus in on this to start with. Right? So I mentioned this is one whole thought, right? So there's a lot going on in this one thought. It's a complicated thought, okay? But then there were a couple keywords that made me think, oh man, we should really probably hone in on this, which is the if. And why would an if make me kind of perk up my attention? Well, if then clauses are some of the most powerful clauses in the Bible, right? Because it sets up, in grammar, it's a conditional clause, right? If this, then this. If X thing should happen, should be accomplished, should be done, then, and the then acts as a guarantee. If this, so this is the condition. Well, if this happens, and it might or it might not. But if it does, then guarantee this is what's going to happen. Okay? So we have this if, and so as soon as I see an if, I'm looking for a then. And that then comes in verse 5, right near the end of the sentence. And it's a powerful then. You will understand the fear of the Lord, and you will find the knowledge of God. Now, we could probably spend a long time just on that verse. But you will understand the fear of the Lord. Well, remember how important the fear of the Lord was in chapter 1, right? It's the beginning of knowledge. And right, verse 5 even sets up that relationship. You will understand the fear of the Lord, and you will find the knowledge of God. Why? Because those things, we already knew those things went together. And this is the beginning of the whole process. So if this fear of the Lord was the beginning of knowledge, right? And knowledge was the beginning of that process we looked at in chapter 1. Is this like the prequel? Well, we're going to have to find out. But you can also see from the way this sentence is structured that this is also outlining things that we might need to do, right? Verb, you receive. Verb, treasure up my commandments. Make your ear attentive. Incline your heart. Call out. Raise your voice. Seek it. Search. So this is just one big set of verbs, right? So this is all stuff that we probably need to do. And we might not know how to do any of it, which means we're going to have to talk about every single verb, and then how every single verb relates to the verb with it in its verse, and then how they relate to each other, and then how they relate to that final verse of understanding the fear of the Lord, and then how it relates to the process of knowledge, right? So when I started picking up on these keywords in these first 5 verses, I was like, yeah, there's no way we're getting past this in the chapter. And hopefully you can see why that is now. But let's get going. We might not even get past the first couple verses. We'll have to see. But let's start with our questions. My son. So there's that my son again, just to point it out. When he says this kind of should bring up, this is very personal. This is the kind of one-on-one talk that he's having. This isn't a super general talk. This is the one-on-one kind of deal. If you signals the same thing, receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you. Okay. So let's just focus in, right, on these verbs. So why are we receiving? Why are we treasuring? Right? And then follow-up question, why are we receiving his words? And follow-up question, why are we treasuring commandments? Okay. And okay, yeah, let's start there. That's quite a few questions. We'll get to verse 2 soon. So if you receive my word, and I kind of already talked about this, but you would want to be able to ask yourself, if you didn't have that preparation, well, why is this an if? And whenever you see an if, look for a then. It may not come, right? Yeah, there's probably if phrases that don't have a then in them. Maybe. I'm not positive about that. But it's very likely you'll be able to look for a then, and then the then makes the if make sense. Because basically the if signals a condition. Okay. So, and that's actually a good, I'm glad we talked about that for a second, because that's actually a good frame for the rest of the sentence, right? This is the frame of all of our other questions, right? Like even just this first one we're starting on, the receiving and the treasuring are both part of the frame of the condition, right? We're not going to get out of this condition until verse 5. Everything else is going to be part of the if blah, 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 blah. So that's definitely the frame. Okay. So why are we receiving? Why words? Why are we treasuring commandments? Okay. Well, why may have been too deep a question, actually. We may actually have to start with, what does it mean to receive and treasure? What does it mean to receive and treasure? Okay, so we actually talked about what it means to receive some in Proverbs 1. Receiving has to do with actually taking it in. Okay, so in chapter 1, and if you haven't gone and watched the chapter 1 videos, you definitely should. I'm going to keep referencing them probably for the rest of Proverbs, because that first chapter sets the tone for pretty much the whole book. That receiving is the point at which you don't just have it in your brain, right? You're not just sort of wrestling with it as something other than yourself. You've actually taken it into your heart, and are allowing it to transform you. Okay, that's what it means to receive, to take in, particularly to your heart, for the sake of transformation. Okay. And then to treasure. Well, to treasure, to value, to esteem highly, to put in its proper place or special place. Okay. So, if you take in my words, if for the sake of the transformation of your heart, and if you esteem highly my commandments, if you put them in your proper place, and actually I think treasure continues to have another connotation of you're holding on to it, right? You're keeping it, and you're keeping it safe, and you want, you maybe even, it implies you want more of it. Because if you treasure it, right, why would more couldn't be bad? So if you esteem highly and put my commandments in their proper place, holding on to them, okay, that's kind of a rewording of this verse when we swap out what we've defined as receive and to treasure. My words and my commandments with you. So why the words and commandments? So now we can get back to that other question. So now we know what we're doing. But now we have to ask ourselves why. Why these things? So the word commandment, have we seen that word yet in the... Maybe we haven't. I thought we might have seen it right before the call to wisdom. Actually, okay, I was really thinking more of the hear my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Okay, so we haven't seen that word commandment, actually. We have seen words. That was right near the beginning in verse 2, to understand words of insight. Okay, sorry for all the scrolling. Well, then let's break these down. So commandments, we probably have a strong connotation for, right? Makes us think of the Ten Commandments in the law, right? So if you treasure up my commandments, those things which I have commanded you, the things maybe I told you to do, right? So the things I told you to do, that's what a commandment is, right? Or do or not do, right? And to not do just implies a positive do, right? The things I told you to do. And if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments, then when you think of the commandments as an I told you to do this, it places kind of an interesting contrast on the words, right? The words might be more like advice. It might be more like how to do it, right? It might be more like context. It may be more conversational. And so when I think of these words, and particularly if we go back to words of insight from verse 2, right? This is sort of cutting to the heart of the issue. Getting to the core of it, making it clear. So receiving his words could be a lot of things. But I think I'm going to keep, at least in my mind, these words associated with insight. So the words, and that insight could include, just like we talked about, context. It could include method, amongst other things. Okay. And this is, remember, this is all part of that if. All right. Let's keep going. Making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. Oh, wait. Well, we will get to that, but I realized we didn't actually answer the question why. We actually just kind of answered the question, what are the words and what are the commandments, right? So this actually ended up being the question what. Sorry about that. But we were still trying to figure out the why. The why of these things. Okay. So why do you need to receive words, and why do you need to treasure up the commandments? Why do you need to receive words, and why do you need to treasure up the commandments? Well, advice can be pretty hard to take, right? So someone can say lots and lots of things to you. I mean, I'm sure each one of us can think of all the times in their life when someone has just talked at us, and maybe some part of us recognize like, oh, that's good stuff. Yeah, okay, whatever. But that doesn't actually mean we are going to take it in and be changed by it, right? So the words have to make their way from outside us to inside us. And the words also imply, right, that if you receive my words, remember, we're getting this from someone else. And then we're receiving the words. And only once we receive the words can we treasure the words, can we put them in their proper place. So, okay. Let's think of this like a heart. Well, and actually, I'm glad we did read that next verse for just a second. Maybe it kind of put this into my head, right? Inclining your heart to understanding, making your ear attentive to wisdom, inclining your heart to understanding. Well, when I was thinking about the word receive just a second ago, the question kind of popped into my head of, well, where do you receive it to, right? Where do you treasure it? Like, what does that actually look like? And it occurs to me that this why can be potentially answered by considering our hearts. Okay? So we have our hearts, and if I was maybe a better artist, I would have drawn like an anatomical one because that would have been funny. But we'll stick with the heart shape. Things to work on. Receiving these words means that they're actually making their way into your heart, okay? That's what it means to receive them, right? Because the words were out here. And maybe they were thoughts, maybe they were someone else's advice, right? But the words were kind of out there. And to receive them means to take them in. And then if you're going to treasure them, right? If you're going to treasure the commandments and probably treasure these words, right? You need a place for them. You need to put them in your heart in their proper place. But it occurs to me, right? Well, let's outline a place. right? You want to put them, I don't know, would a treasure chest work? Like that's the is that the proper place? I don't know. Treasure chest, or maybe a pedestal. Pedestal probably makes sense, right? And then I don't know, beautiful words like a trophy or a vase. I don't know. It's treasure. Um, Spent too much time on that for it to look that bad. But there is actually a prerequisite to receiving these words. There's an implied prerequisite when you talk about receiving them and treasuring them. Because this heart, right? Well, it was empty, wasn't it? So I just drew wherever I wanted. I could have drawn in any place in this heart, right? I could have drawn here. I could have drawn it here. I did draw it there and there. I could have drawn it over here, right? Because there's tons of room. Is that how our hearts are? I don't think so. I think our hearts probably look more like this. Right? They're junky. There's stuff in them, right? And I'm just filling it with random shapes now. It's just there's just crud in there. That's what our hearts are like, right? There's all kinds of stuff. This is idols, right? This is loves and desires, right? This is all kinds of junk. So, how are we going to receive these words? How are we going to treasure them up? How are we going to put them in their proper place? Is the proper place right here? Are you going to put the words just kind of in the middle right there? Like, oh, well, I can kind of squeeze some in there, and then I can kind of squeeze a word in here and in here. Is that the proper place? Is that receiving those words? Right? I mean, imagine the word, right, reception. Right? When you think of reception, what do you think of? I think of, and maybe my mind is a little more dramatic, but a reception maybe for like a wedding, right? The wedding reception is the big gathering afterwards. It's the party. It's the joy. It's the equivalent of a red carpet, where the bride and the groom, they're coming down and, oh, everyone's so excited and they're coming into the room and everyone cheers and they raise their glasses and they sit at the head of the table, right? And there's cake and there's dancing and there's all these wonderful things. And that's what it means to receive, right? To come in with joy, to make the main event. And would this little doodah, would that be the main event in your heart? No, it wouldn't. Which means it's in order to receive, in order to treasure, there actually has to be room. And maybe, you can't clean out the whole thing. But the starting point, right, is to make room to begin to treasure these things, right? To say, what is my treasure, right? Well, I'm going to decide that the words of wisdom, they're my treasure. So I'm going to put them in their proper place. And yeah, sure, they're still surrounded by junk. There's still idols in my life. There's still desires. There's still misplaced loves. But I'm going to make a place for wisdom, and I'm going to treasure them. Treasure that wisdom. And I'm going to receive those words. And those words now are going to go straight into this spot in my heart, this spot that I have set aside that is going to be my bastion and my stronghold, that the rest of my heart will eventually be affected by. Yeah. Because if there's not room in our hearts to take these things in, you can't treasure them. And that's the first if, right? If you receive my words. Well, there's two, right? A conditional works both ways, right? Well, if this does happen, then this, right? But it's also possible that it won't happen. It's actually possible that you won't or can't receive these words that he's giving you. It may not be the choice of, see, this is tricky. We've said many times, right, that you have a choice. But sometimes choices are made for us by our previous choices, right? Choices have the power to limit our future choices. And when you hear the words of the wise, you may think, "Oh, I want to receive that so bad. I just want to take it in." But your previous choices have made it such that there's no room in your heart. Right? And so you're like, "Well, I made the right choice, didn't I?" Yeah, you kind of did this time, but you didn't really have that choice because of the choices you've already made. So we have to make choices that will open up more potential for better future choices, right? And we actually do that by creating and preserving that space. And when I say we do it, I only sort of mean that in a vague sense, because you can't really erase the stuff in your heart like I erased these lines, right? My markup. You can't do that. But God can, right? And you got to wonder, right? Who are you receiving these words from? Who are you treasuring up these commandments from? And if these commandments, if these words end up, right, getting us to the then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God, well, then who am I asking this from? Like, who am I in verse 3? Who am I calling out to? Who am I raising my voice to? Well, presumably, right, it's the Lord. And yes, I do need to call it to other people, and we'll talk about that too. But the only person who can really change our hearts is the Lord. And so, but we have to be able to receive him. So we have to be able to say, "You know what, Lord? You are going to be a priority. Here's the room that I can make. And you know what? It may not be very much." Right? The room that I make may not be very much, but this is me saying my new priority is you, Lord. And now that you're here with me, right? Now that the words of wisdom are in there, now you can imagine that this space is going to tendril out, right? It's going to create new spaces because you have new power now, right? When there was nothing in there, no power, right? What can you do? But as soon as the space is filled by something that is powerful, by something that is effective, by something that's fruitful, then your heart can then begin to change. Oh dear. And suddenly some of these spaces get cleared out. And now wisdom has more places to be put and to be treasured, to be received. And that's the process of changing your heart, right? This isn't a snap of the fingers. It is a process. Even this reception and treasuring, right? So this should, right, put us in on some pretty big a pretty big hint that if this very first commandment is a process, right? So if verse 1 is itself a process, then, and it's funny that we're doing an if then, then I think then the whole thing is a process. Right? So we're going to have to consider that these aren't just like sort of separate conditions, that this is all a procession of conditions. But 2, right, that this is not about perfection. And that should be a deep encouragement. This is not about perfection. Because if I had to have my whole heart clean to receive the words of wisdom, well, it's just not going to happen, is it? Right? Like no more issues, no more idols, no more misplaced loves, right? The whole thing has to be cleaned out, and then wisdom will come into my heart. No. Wisdom wants to come in as soon as you make room, right? Because only in the power of wisdom are you going to be able to continue to be transformed. Remember, there's a spectrum of wisdom. There's simple, there's foolish, there's simple, but then there's wise, and that's just the beginning, because then there's more wise, and then there's more wise than that, right? And then there's perfection, and that's way over on the line, right? And so even this very first step is a process. And what's amazing is that you don't have to complete the process of that step, right? The whole cleaning out of your heart. You actually get to go on the process like in miniature through the whole thing, right? If you receive my words and you start this process, well, and if and we can maybe make an assumption that if you start the process of all these other things, well, then you'll understand the fear of the Lord. You'll find the knowledge of God, not completely, not perfectly, not totally, not as much as you might, not as much as you will, if you keep going, if you persevere, but in proportion to the place you are in the process. And I'm going to write that down. And I'm going to phrase it a little differently. Like, you bear fruit, you understand in proportion to your place in the process. And that's okay. That's good. All right. Well, our time is up, and we did not even make it past verse 1. So I guess I made the right decision in only pursuing verses 1 through 5. It may take us 5 videos. I don't know. Maybe the next ones will go a little faster, but we did lay a lot of groundwork. So let's go ahead and review that. So we started out recognizing the if-then condition and realizing that we needed to use this as our frame for understanding this whole section of the verses. We started to ask these why questions, but we realized that we first had to ask, well, what are these things? And we had to define the words receive and treasure, which we began to realize were taking into the heart for transformation, and then to value and to hold on to. Okay? So, my son, if you take in my words for the sake of transformation, if you esteem highly, you value and hold on to my commandments, okay? That's kind of the way we reworded the verse. But then we had to ask ourselves, all right, well, what are these words? What are the commands? But more importantly, why are we doing this? And oh my goodness, did we ever answer that? Well, yeah, okay, you know what? I'm going to say yes, we did. Maybe we're going to answer it a little bit more in this review, right? Because it's this kind of picture that kind of answers that question. Why are we taking these words in? It's because, I don't know, okay. It's because this is not oh dear. This is not us. Okay? This clean, easy heart, right? That doesn't have anything going on in it. That you can just put the treasure anywhere. There's lots of room. That's not us. Okay? So we have to receive these words of wisdom so that our hearts can begin to be changed, so that the process can continue. We have to take in the commandments because the words and the commandments, they have power, they're truth, and they change us. And so when we make room in our hearts to say, okay, I'm going to prioritize these things, I want these things, and then they come in and they make a stronghold, they make a bastion that's going to change the rest of our hearts. That's why we have to take them in. That's why we have to receive them. That's why we have to put them in their proper place, because only from that place of power and authority can they begin to truly change our hearts. Whereas if you just kind of stick them in the cracks, that's never going to happen, right? Like they're just going to be squished away, and they're never going to be able to assert themselves and change you. And as we talked about this nature of the heart, we began to realize, right, that verse 1 is itself a process. And if it's a process, then yes, this whole set of verses is probably a process. But I think more importantly, we realize that this whole thing is not about perfection. The far end goal is perfection. Yes, we are striving towards perfection, towards the most wise, being the most wise, right, which is divine. But we get to start on the process, and we even get the fruit and rewards of the process while we're still in the process. It doesn't have to be complete. It doesn't have to be whole. It doesn't have to be perfect. And that's pretty amazing. That's pretty encouraging, because there's nothing you have to do to get yourself ready and acceptable for this. You just have to say, you know what? I want what you're offering. That's it. There just has to be some room. And we can do that. By the grace of God, we can do that. See you in the next video as we start to look at verse 2 and beyond. Appreciate your time. This is a really beautiful foundation for where we're going, and I'm excited for where this journey is going to take us. Hope to see you there.